Good evening, MOCA friends. My name is Yifan Wu, Director of Programs and Chief of Staff at the Museum of Chinese in America. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual presentation with scholar Sam Wong and Evelyn Wong, who will delve into the life and legacy of Kuang Qizhao. Kuang was the first Chinese person to write a Chinese English dictionary and serve as the official translator for the Chinese Educational Mission in Hartford, Connecticut from 1872 to 1882. The CEM marked the first instance of the Qing government sending students abroad to learn from the United States. During his time in Hartford, Kuang interacted with a diverse array of Americans, forming close friendships with many intellectuals in Connecticut. These relationships influenced his reform ideas, particularly the importance of Western education for China's modernization. Kuang was also an early and vocal defender of Chinese immigrants in the US. In light of the current US-China relations, Kuang's experiences with Chinese exclusion laws are particularly relevant to Chinese Americans today. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please consider supporting MOCA. Your generosity is vital to our institution and helps us create future programs that inspire and uplift diverse communities. You may donate on our website at mocanyc.org. Thank you for joining us as we explore Kuang Qizhao's contribution to both Chinese and American history and literature. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Sam to start the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yifan, for that introduction. Let me get our slideshow going. For those of you who don't know, I'm actually located out in Hong Kong. So we're roughly 12 hours apart. Okay. All right. So most of you have probably heard of the Chinese educational mission, but I suspect most people have not heard of Kuang Qizhao. Why is Kuang interesting? He was the first person to write a Chinese English dictionary. So if you had ancestors that came here in the 1880s or 1870s, they probably used his dictionary. He was he was among the first educated Chinese officials to come to the US and to observe American society. His observations on American society are really relevant today, given Chinese Americans, again, now face racism and tense US-China relations. He was one of the earliest defenders of Chinese Americans as he fought to defeat the Chinese Exclusion Act. He brought back, when he came back to China, he brought back ideas that would help China modernize. Ideas such as Western education and women's rights. But he also had an overlooked contribution. He and the other Chinese had an indirect impact on the development of American literature through their relationship with Mark Twain. He helped Twain empathize with the Chinese and understand, really, the evils of racism. So, about Kuang. Kuang was born in Taisan. That's where a lot of the original Chinese that came to the United States came from. Put on the laser pointer here. So this is the Taisan area of Guangdong province in the southern part of China. He was born in 1845. He was the youngest of 5 sons from a farming family. This is the house that he was raised in Taisan. He moved to Guangzhou at around 15 years of age. He told his parents that he did not want to be a farmer. So he was therefore sent to live with a relative who owned a small shop. We don't have a picture of what those small shops look like, but this is what Guangzhou looked like back in the 1860s. Kuang then moved to Hong Kong. He sold Chinese herbal medicines in Hong Kong for, he says, a few years. These are pictures of what Hong Kong looked like back then. Around 1860, Kuang looked to make his fortune in Australia. There was a major gold rush here in Melbourne, Australia. As most of you know, most of the people in California that looked for gold actually didn't find it. The people who made money were the ones that actually serviced the gold miners, like Levi's who made jeans. So Kuang, calling himself a doctor, serviced the miners by selling herbal medicines to the Chinese gold miners. He spent 5 years in Australia. He then returned to Hong Kong in July of 1865 on this ship, the Gem of the Ocean. In Hong Kong, he studied English. He attended the government central school. This is the first public school in Hong Kong run by the British. And here you can see pictures of the students in the later years. He became a dictionary pioneer at only 23 years of age. In 1868, he was the first native Chinese person to publish a Chinese English dictionary. It was called the English and Chinese Lexicon. At that moment, he used the name Kuang Qizhao. Kuang was then appointed to the Chinese Educational Mission in Shanghai. The Chinese Educational Mission was really China's first study abroad program, led by Wong over here. He's the first Chinese to graduate from a US university at Yale. The idea was to, given China's backwardness, these students here would go to the US with the idea to learn about modern technology and warfare and about American civilization. Kuang worked initially as the English teacher and as the principal in Shanghai. It was for the CEM preparatory school. This is the school that was designed to get these kids up to speed in their English before they went to the US. And that was located somewhere on the Bund up in Shanghai. And these are pictures of the Bund. Kuang also became a newspaper pioneer. He helped establish the Huibao in Shanghai. This is one of China's first native-owned newspapers. This newspaper was a very, very highly nationalistic newspaper. Then in the summer of 1874, Huang escorts the third batch of Chinese educational mission students to the United States. He takes the steamship Japan. This is the boat that he took, and he crosses the Pacific. They first went to Japan and they went into San Francisco. And when they get off the ship, they took a picture, and this is what the students looked like back then. He arrived in San Francisco in September of 1874. He stays here in the Occidental Hotel. This is not a normal study abroad program. They actually traveled in luxury because they were really representing the Chinese government, and they had actually a pretty nice travel budget. But he was interviewed. He and the students were interviewed, and the American press was really impressed. They called him cultured, friendly, and wealthy. This is what San Francisco looked like back then. He and the students took a tour of Chinatown. Then took the Transcontinental Railroad, which was, of course, built by the Chinese. And then they made it over to Hartford and Connecticut, Hartford and Massachusetts. These circles show you where the students were sent. And so after Kuang sent the students then lived with the host families. And these are pictures of the mothers of the host family mothers. They were really, really kind to the kids. And many of the kids really developed real love for their host mothers. And real bicultural friendships developed. Here you can see this picture of, a Chinese boy, but also with his friend, a white boy dressed in this Chinese boy's clothes. So, real friendships were being developed because of living in the US. Kuang then visits Washington, D.C. in November of 1874. He stays again at another nice hotel, the Ebit Hotel. He visits the Washington Naval Yard. He was then given a 15-gun salute by Commodore Thomas H. Patterson. He was also given demonstration of the Gatling gun. He then meets with Ulysses S. Grant and his cabinet. So that also includes Orville Babcock, the Chief of Staff, George Robinson, who's the Secretary of the Navy, and General Montgomery Meigs. We think what they were trying to do is he was looking to buy ships and guns for the defense of Taiwan. Japan had just invaded Taiwan, and China was worrying that they did not have enough weapons to defend against the Japanese. He then takes a ship from New York to London. He stays here at the Windsor Hotel. Again, you can see a very nice hotel. This is what New York looked like back then, and this is a ship. He arrived in London. What's interesting is that the ship records list him as the Honorable Kuang Qizhao, misspelling, the Imperial Commissioner to the Court of St. James. That is the title of an ambassador to Queen Victoria. We don't know if that was a mistake or perhaps maybe he was given a temporary title as ambassador. We think his likely purpose was to purchase Navy ships and guns. He leaves Europe for Marseille. These are pictures of Marseille back then. He basically circumnavigates the globe. Just a few years ago, Jules Verne had just published the book Around the World in 80 Days. Kuang basically did it in 164 days. So from New York, he went to London, London to Marseille, then to Italy, to the Suez Canal, Sri Lanka, Singapore, Vietnam, Hong Kong, and then back to Shanghai. On his return to Shanghai, he actually published his second edition of the dictionary. This time it's called the English and Chinese Dictionary. But as soon as he returns, he learns that he used to be the official translator for the Chinese educational mission back in Hartford. So he has to go back. And he returned to Hartford at the end of 1875 as the official translator. This is the headquarters building in Hartford. And this is inside that headquarters building. These are pictures of the students. In 1876, he visits the Philadelphia World Expo. And there he could see the latest technologies that were on display. There were also exhibits on American education and on the achievements of women. Kuang would, he learned a lot at this exhibit, and he would take back some of these ideas and promote these ideas. So when he went back to China, he promoted the importance of technology and of innovation. He would emphasize the importance of American education, the Western-oriented education, and women's rights. CM students were special guests at the exhibition. You can see these are various illustrations of their visit. When they were there, they actually met with President Ulysses Grant, and President Grant shook the hands of every child. Here's a picture of what the students here at the Chinese exhibition. But this was a story that was covered by the press. They were very, very impressed with the students. And as you know, they met with President Grant again. The students really, really developed strong friendships in the United States. They played baseball. You can see the baseball players here. Walter Camp was inventing football over at Yale. One student, Zhongwen Yao, became coxswain and led the Yale team to victory over Harvard. And some married with local Americans. This is Yong Kwai and his wife. Now, while the students were making friends in their respective schools and at Yale and other colleges, Kuang was making friends with his neighbors, and he lived in a really special neighborhood. This neighborhood was called Nook Farm. Among his neighbors were Mark Twain, the writer, his best friend Joseph Twitchell, who was the pastor of the church there. Charles Warner was the editor of the Hartford Courant. He co-wrote with Mark Twain the very famous book, The Gilded Age. There's also Joseph Hawley, who was a Connecticut senator. This here is Isabella Beecher Hooker. That was the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe. This is Harriet Beecher Stowe's house. This is Mark Twain's house. So he had some really prominent intellectuals as neighbors. Kuang also developed a relationship with educators. Education was something he was really focused on. So he knew Noah Porter, the president of Yale, Charles Eliot, the president of Harvard, Andrew White, the president of Cornell, D.C. Gilman, the president of Hopkins, and a number of other educators. But in addition to the good things that he learned about in America, he would also learn about the problems with its political system. President Garfield was assassinated because of someone who was not appointed, because he was not appointed to the civil service position that he wanted. The Credit Mobilier scandal involved bribery of politicians and railroad rights. Tammany Hall was the famous political machine that controlled politicians. And then the whiskey ring involved the bribery of officials. So it was a time of corruption and polarization. But what really was most relevant to Kuang was the issue of Chinese exclusion. Seeking the presidency, Senator James G. Blaine attacked the Chinese to win votes. You know, according to the historian Andrew Giori, who wrote a book on the issue, before 1879, Blaine never expressed any hostility towards the Chinese. Racism was really confined to California and the Western states. The working class all around the US in general was not hostile to the Chinese. But Blaine realized that by elevating racism to a national level, he could win the important electoral votes from the Western states. So in a 1879 speech advocating for exclusion, he creates a false narrative that the Chinese are evil. He says, slave traffickers have brought Chinese as slaves and will lower wages. What's interesting about the speech, it is so similar to what is going on today in the United States. Again, the issue is China is lowering wages for Americans in the US. The imagery of slaves, a big criticism of China is that apparently they have slaves in Xinjiang. Just like they were accusing the Chinese that in the United States of being slaves brought in by the Chinese 6 companies. Blaine says they live in great filth and have the potential to breed a plague equal to the Black Death. Remember, Trump called COVID the China virus. Chinese women, he says, are impure and lewd. That was a justification of the Atlantic killings about, 4 or 5 years ago, when they thought those Korean women were Chinese and were prostitutes. And then the American people have to choose whether we will have for the Pacific Coast the civilization of Christ or the civilization of Confucius. Very simple. Try to create a simple binary. You either have Jesus or you have Confucius. And today, what is that binary? It's either authoritarianism or democracy. So for the Chinese, it was clear that Blaine was using the Chinese for politics. Yale professor Samuel Wells Williams, who was a friend of Yung Wing and a friend of Kuang's, he wrote in his diary on that day, in his personal diary, he goes, I wonder that Blaine should have lent himself to it and told all the nonsense and errors the papers ascribed to him. His actions are all a bid for the lowest strata on the Pacific coast. The New York Sun says, every step which Mr. Blaine takes in politics has reference to his personal ambition to be president of the United States. Wing himself says, Blaine, in his autobiography, says, Blaine has the presidential bee buzzing in his bonnet. What really upset Kuang was that the senators were calling the Chinese an inferior race. This was the time when social Darwinism was really starting to take hold. Senator John Jones says the Chinese stole the inventions of gunpowder and the printing press from the stray Aryan Caucasian people who had wandered into their midst. He couldn't admit that the Chinese had invented these things. So he wanted to make sure that the Aryan race got credit for it. James George goes, the Chinese are an inferior and degraded race. Henry Teller, the white superior class will lose their willingness to work once they realize that an inferior class of people like the Chinese are taking the jobs they once employed. Then Miller goes, why not discriminate? Why aid in the increase and distribution over the surface of our domain of a degraded and inferior race? Kuang was irate. So here you can see Kuang's response. He writes in a letter, with the labor for the Transcontinental Railroad, was the labor of this inferior race of an inferior quality? And then he uses very, very pedantic words to show that he was not inferior. He says, can the persons who use these opprobrious epithets claim to be good specimens and representatives of the so-called superior race? Kuang was frustrated with the fake news and really the impossibility of countering these false narratives. The San Francisco Chronicle had claimed that, a man named Li Poi Fun had once owned a large plantation in China and was the owner of 2,000 slaves. Kuang knew this was just fake news. He knew this person. He knew he did not have a plantation. So Kuang wrote a letter to the editor, and he calls this a gross misrepresentation. Other newspapers put in claims that a flood of Chinese immigrants were rushing to the US on 17 steamers. Kuang knew that, it was impossible to charter 17 steamers from Hong Kong. It's usually one ship that travels per week. It's impossible to get 17. He writes, I speak knowingly. Time will determine the truth. Kuang wrote many articles defending the Chinese against the exclusion. He was just really angry about what was going on. So he got his articles into some of the most prominent newspapers, the San Francisco Chronicle, the New York Herald, the New York Tribune, Scientific American, Hartford Daily Courant. In 1881, what surprised Americans is he published a dictionary that was actually meant for Americans. This is a dictionary called a Dictionary of English Phrases. What it was that he compiled the list of hard to understand English phrases, such as to make a long story short, take for granted, catch one napping at the 11th hour. He had worked very closely with the Merriam brothers. I'm sure we all know about the Merriam-Webster's dictionary. It's the Merriam brothers who had the rights to the Webster's dictionary. This dictionary was endorsed by the presidents of Yale, Harvard, Hopkins, Cornell, and a whole bunch of other educators. It astounded people that someone from an inferior race could actually write a dictionary. This is a letter that came from Charles W. Eliot. And this is what Eliot writes, that a Chinese scholar should have produced in the heart of New England a book in English and about English, which gives proof of so much knowledge, discrimination, and industry is a fact which thoughtful people will like to ponder. Okay. It's just like, how can a Chinese person be writing a dictionary in English for a superior culture? This is his I guess it's hard to see, but it just flabbergasted people. Here are selected quotes from the press. New York Times writes, this book is a direct challenge thrown to the demagogues who denounce the Chinaman. Boston Literary World, more than a curiosity, a really intelligible, and useful contribution to lexicography. The New York Nation. It will amaze the Sandlot gentry. These were the anti-Chinese racists in San Francisco. It will amaze the Sandlot gentry to be informed that this remarkable work will supplement our English dictionaries, even for Native Americans. The Sacramento newspaper writes, it is certainly difficult to perceive wherein a Chinaman, like Kuang, is inferior to the most cultivated European or American. And if Kuang, why not an indefinite number of other Chinamen? Maybe we shouldn't be excluding them. The Boston Herald writes, its merits are so conspicuous that we do not marvel that the presidents of Harvard and Yale have endorsed it with almost unqualified praise. The Daily Times writes, simply, one of the most remarkable works issued in this country. But despite all of his efforts, Kuang failed. The Chinese Exclusion Act passed. There was just really no way that he could counter the narrative that the Chinese were evil. So Kuang concludes, I fear that some of the supporters of the anti-Chinese bills do not act from principle, but are seeking under cover of this bill to promote some selfish end, such as their own re-election or their possible nomination for the presidency. So he understood it was really politics. Now I'm going to pass it over to Evelyn, who has been doing a lot of work on how the Chinese may have impacted Mark Twain.
So during this period, some intellectuals were beginning to understand the linkage of racism between Black people and Chinese. So Thomas Nast was one of those. Nast, one of Twain's friends, would write political cartoons in support of the Chinese. So here in this cartoon, which is clearly criticizing Blaine, we can see that on a left-hand side, Blaine has succeeded as he is suppressing a Black person, and the Black person is behaving in a very subservient way towards him. And on the right-hand side, he is pushing away an ordinary Chinese businessman, showing that his next target is the Chinese. And English scholars are increasingly arguing that the Chinese had a major influence on Mark Twain, the father of American literature. So Selina Lai Henderson and Xuan Shu are two of the most recent English scholars that have published books arguing this. So our research will basically build upon the work of these English scholars, but by providing specific examples of how Kuang and the Chinese may have influenced Twain. As the translator, Kuang would have been one of the main Chinese to have communicated with Twain. In his journal, Twitchell, one of Twain's friends, writes that we talked with them, the Chinese, as we could through Kuang, who spoke English with considerable ease. And as we were doing our research, we were surprised to see this article from the New Haven Register. To dine with Kuang Qizhao has been the desire of many eminent gentlemen in Hartford, but in order to do so, it has been necessary to receive the social endorsement from Rev. Joe Twitchell and Mark Twain. So to see Kuang, one had to get the approval of Mark Twain, so it shows that Kuang and Twain had a relationship. There's more circumstantial evidence in the strong similarities of their writings on how a country should modernize. In Twain's A Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, which Xuan Shu strongly emphasizes was influenced by the Chinese educational mission, Twain writes that the first thing you want in a new country is a patent office. Then you would want to work up your school system. And after that, out with your paper. And in Kuang's first conversation book, in a section called Means of Promoting a Nation's Wealth, Prosperity, and Military Power, that there is a need to emphasize a need to establish schools for persons of both sexes, to develop technology by granting patents to inventors and discoverers, and to also encourage newspapers. So Twain's most famous book was Huckleberry Finn, which was clearly about Huck, a poor white boy, and a runaway slave called Jim. And it appears to have nothing to do with the Chinese. And we are not trying to argue that the Chinese influence was greater than the Black influence. But before Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn, he actually wrote the play Ah Sin, which is this photo right here. And English scholar Selina Lai Henderson argues that Twain's writings on the Chinese were a rehearsal for his satires focused on racism towards African Americans. Now, building upon the work of these scholars, we have identified 4 areas where Kuang and the Chinese may have influenced Twain. So firstly, the fallacy of racial superiority. In Huckleberry Finn, the book is about Huck, a poor white boy, and Jim, a runaway slave. What's interesting is that English scholar Shelley Fisher Fishkin actually says that the most intelligent character in this play was Black. But before he wrote Huckleberry Finn, Twain actually made a Chinese person the most intelligent character in the play Ah Sin. Like Jim, Ah Sin had to hide his intelligence until the right moment, and by the end of the play, he is clearly the most intelligent character. But why would Twain do this? We think it is because that Twain could observe that the Chinese were not inferior. As Wing was a Yale graduate, Kuang was a dictionary writer, and at that time, dictionary writers were considered to be extremely intelligent, and the president of Yale was the editor for the Webster's Dictionary. And lastly, the CEM students won many academic awards. Secondly, the possibility for friendship between different races. In Huckleberry Finn, Huck develops a very strong friendship with Jim, the runaway slave, someone who he is willing to go to hell in order to protect. And similarly in Ah Sin, the Chinese character becomes good friends with a white man, and he ends up even saving his life. So Twain could observe that the Chinese and white people could develop strong relationships. An example is how Kuang made many friends, and he developed a very deep connection with Julia Philly. She writes in her diary, "I wish to do anything I can for them. It all seems so strange that the Chinese have come to us, and we welcome them." So Julia had really meant what she said. Kuang's wife passed away in 1877, and desperate for help, Julia, who was over 60 at that time, offered to take care of Kuang's baby right here. And later, Kuang would move in with her. Very grateful for her help on his return back to China, he would send her many gifts. Rong Hong also marries a white woman, a very loving relationship that both Twain and Twitchell could observe. The CEM students also developed very strong relationships, and many even dated white women. So William Phelps, a classmate of the CEM students, writes in his autobiography that when the Chinese youth entered the social arena, none of us had any chance. Their manner to the girls had a deferential elegance far beyond our possibilities. I can remember the pained expressions on the faces of my American comrades as the girls deliberately passed them by and accepted the attentions of Chinese rivals with a much more than yielding grace. Thirdly, a belief in the common humanity of all races as reflected by the Golden Rule, the principle of many cultures where you treat others the way that you would want to be treated. And in his autobiography, Twain writes, "We borrowed the Golden Rule from Confucius after it has been in service for centuries and have copyrighted it without blush." But Twain wasn't a Confucian scholar, so where could he have learned this? Before Twain was saying this, Kuang was telling American senators who called the Chinese inferior that they should follow the Golden Rule, which Jesus uttered 500 years ago. Do not unto others what you do not wish them to do to you. Twitchell, Twain's best friend, could clearly observe the common humanity. And according to his journal, he and his wife visited Kuang's house, where their wives met. And Twitchell observes that it was an interesting sight to see the two mothers meet, each armed with her own offspring, with female curiosity dilating in her eyes. There were various touches of nature that made us all seem kin. So even though the wives could not talk to each other due to language barrier, Twitchell could still sense their common humanity. Fourthly and lastly, the iniquity of Western imperialism. So, before he met the Chinese in Hartford, Twain felt quite positively over the American takeover in Hawaii, but his views slowly began to change as he met the Chinese. And we think that Kuang may have been one of the Chinese who educated Twain against the problems of imperialism. In one book, Kuang criticizes the Christian nations for invading China and about the destruction of the Summer Palace in Beijing and the governor's mansion in Guangzhou. And Twain would write frequently against imperialism. One example is how he criticizes missionaries for attempting to make the Chinaman desert his church. And another example is that in the article, To the Person Sitting in the Darkness, he criticizes missionary activity for seeking indemnities from the Chinese after the Boxer Rebellion.
Okay, but unfortunately, he did have a relationship with Twain, but the Qing government closed the Chinese educational mission in around 1880. There are several reasons for it. First, the conservatives in the Chinese government claimed that the students were becoming too westernized. Some became Christians, and some of them were cutting off their cues, which you're just not supposed to do. But the government was also upset at American racism and how they were treating the Chinese in the U.S. At the same time, they're also upset that the U.S. reneged on their agreement to allow the students to study at the military academies. Kuang remained in the U.S. To complete his books. He stayed there until 1883. But while he was there, for the last year that he was there, he spent a lot of time campaigning against the opium trade. By 1882, he had actually become a minor celebrity. This is an advertisement which Kuang had endorsed on a handwriting course. So you can see after he took the course, this is his new signature. But it shows you that, he was prominent enough that he became, that people sought him out to become an endorser of an advertisement. Before he left, he actually applied for U.S. citizenship, but he was actually turned down because of the new Chinese Exclusion Act. So Kuang returned to Shanghai in March of 1883, where he worked for the Jiangnan Arsenal and as a translator for the Shanghai government. This is what Shanghai looked like back then. But then the Sino-French War happened in 1884 to 1885. It was a war over Vietnam, in which the French basically sunk the entire Chinese fleet in Fuzhou. Just after that, he was appointed to be deputy for foreign affairs in Viceroy Zhang Zhedong's office in Guangzhou. This is a picture of Zhang Zhedong's house in Guangzhou, and this is Zhang Zhedong. After the Sino-French War ended, he was sent to Vietnam. In 1885, he was one of the commissioners sent to withdraw troops from Vietnam at the end of the Sino-French War. He was almost shot when bandits attacked his boats. 2 people on his boat were killed. In 1886, he starts the Guangbao. That's the newspaper for Guangzhou. It was the second largest circulating newspaper in China, next to the Shanghai's Shenbao. It was a very, very highly reform-oriented newspaper and very, very highly nationalistic. However, Zhang leaves Guangdong in 1889. He was sent to become the viceroy of Hubei and Hunan. He was replaced by the corrupt Li Hanzhang. This is Li Hongzhang's brother. Kuang was then fired in 1891. He served as a translator for Tsar Nicholas II's visit to Guangzhou in 1891. He was fired just after that visit. We think he was fired because of his frequent reporting on corruption in Li Hanjiang's government. It's really not a wise idea to talk about corruption that your boss is getting involved in. He was also opposed to the fact that Li Hanjiang was not promoting the modernization efforts that projects that Zhang Zhidong had been promoting. So after the firing, Kuang became depressed and passed away in June of 1891 from what's the newspapers say, a boil on the back of the neck, which continued to get larger. He died at about 46 years of age. The government forced the closure of the newspaper by the end of the year. And so he's basically been forgotten by historians. You won't really find much on him. There's no Wikipedia page. But we have spent the last 14 years gathering information on him, and we are convinced that he did make contributions to China's modernizations. These ideas that his contributions are transmitted through 4 channels. One, his publications, his dictionaries and English textbooks, newspapers, the Huibao and the Guangbao, his government service. He worked for the 2 leading reformers in China, Li Hongzhang and Zhang Zhidong, and also through his network of reformers. So you can see he produced many more books on learning English. The first reading book, the first conversation book, second conversation book, correspondence and social usages. He embeds his reform ideas inside these books. Like in this first reading book, there are pictures of some of the latest technologies of mines and farming equipment. Here you can see Kuang's network of friends and how ideas got transmitted from the United States over to China. On the left-hand side, you can see the many contacts that he made with Westerners, with educators, with writers, religious figures, and others. On the right-hand side, you can see his contacts with the Chinese, officials, reformers, various institutions. From all these different lines, you can see how all these different people, they all knew each other. It was a very, very small community. So it's easy. And if Kuang told an idea to this person can then pass it on to their friends. So it's easy to transmit ideas. Kuang had special relationships with 3 people. And that's where I think he got most of ideas transmitted to. There's Zhang Zhidong, which you talked about. He would become the leading reformer inside of China. Zheng Guangyin. Zheng Guangyin and Kuang had worked together in establishing the newspapers, and Zheng Guangyin would write one very, very famous book, Wang Tao. Wang Tao was actually the he was a publisher who is a newspaper publisher and a book publisher, and he had actually published Kuang's books. But he would also write a lot of reform-oriented articles. So what are some of those ideas that Kuang passed on to China? The most important one is that wealth and power is not from weapons, but from universal education. The idea of human capital. Back at that time, most Chinese officials were saying, hey, if we want China to become powerful, we need to get the weapons from the US and we need to maybe learn about their technology. Nobody mentioned education. So this is what Kuang wrote in his first conversation book. And he addresses it to, how can a ruler increase the wealth and power of the nation? He responds, by developing the people and resources of the nation, human capital. In order to do this, education should be encouraged and rendered general by establishing common schools for persons of both sexes. So he wanted universal education for everyone in China, not just for the elite literati. He wanted it for everyone, but not only guys, he wanted it for women, okay? And he says, making them free to all, the poor as well as the rich. Such schools may be supported in greater or less part by general taxation. He's calling for an increase in taxes. That's actually significant. He realizes that The Chinese government had to do more. It was not this, it shouldn't be this libertarian kind of atmosphere where small government, but let everyone do everything. He realized that the government had to play a role. They had to build these schools. And to do that, you needed to increase taxes. So he also felt that the government needed to take a bigger role to encourage innovation. So you need patents, okay, to encourage the entrepreneurship and technology. He all advocated for railroads, mining, factories, postal services. These are the pictures. These two are pictures of mines. This is the latest harvesting equipment that he had published in his first reading book. And of course, Kuang was a big promoter of railroads. He emphasized women's rights. He could tell that the women in America were being treated much better than in China. So he advocated for education for women. He wrote articles opposing foot binding, the murder of baby girls, the sales of women and girls for prostitution. He argued for nationalism. He was one of the earliest people to really promote nationalism in China. He argued for the modernization of the army and the navy. You may not like this, but he advocated for the annexation of Tibet and Korea. He was one of the earliest promoters of economic nationalism, the need to develop China's own industries rather than buy from foreigners. You know, China today is essentially following Kuang's economically nationalistic thoughts, the emphasis on education, technology, and human capital right now. There are some scholars now who are arguing that much of what is going on in China now actually has its roots in the 19th century. But it's important to note that Kuang was not xenophobic. Kuang, like Twain, understood our common humanity and the dangers of xenophobic mobs. In July of 1889, there were accusations that missionaries were extracting the eyes of infants for medicine. There was a potential for a major riot and a potential for a massacre. Kuang came out. In the Guangbao, he said the rumors were ridiculous, and he printed stories warning against agitation. And so a massacre was prevented. The U.S. Consul General Charles Seymour praised the tranquilizing effects of the Guangbao's statement. The Hong Kong Daily News says, the Guangbao has averted a most dangerous anti-foreign demonstration in that excitable and foreigner-hating city. But Kuang was cautious on democracy. He didn't like mob rule. He didn't like mob rule in China. He didn't like the mob rule in the U.S. Here's a picture of a mob in Los Angeles rioting against the Chinese. So he was not a supporter of democracy without a well-educated moral citizenship. The Chinese Exclusion Act provided a bad example for democracy. There's the potential for immoral demagogues like James G. Blaine to manipulate the uneducated. The other thing that he promoted is that you needed a moral basis for society, for people to know what is right and wrong. Science and democracy were not enough. For the West, he recognized Christian culture, that he made good friends with the Yale faculty. The Yale faculty actually put together this petition opposing the Chinese Exclusion Act, and almost every member of the faculty signed that petition. Kuang could see that the religious and educated people were the kinds of people that would oppose the Chinese Exclusion Act. But Kuang was not a Christian. So for China, he emphasized that morality will come from Confucian learning. So the title of this presentation was The Legacy of Kuang Qizhao and the Chinese Education and Chinese Educational Mission. There are really two legacies. There's a negative legacy, which I'm going to start with here, and then the positive legacy. The negative legacy is the viciousness of American politicians and the press. History repeats. what Chinese Americans and US-China relations are experiencing today are very similar to what happened in the late 1870s. There's this tendency for politicians and the press to create fear in the quest for votes and to sell newspapers. The Chinese are easy victims. Back then, none of them had the right to vote. Right now, the Chinese do not vote in a way that politicians will pay attention to. And it's really, really difficult to counter false narratives. But there's also the positive legacy. And that is the positive legacy of our common humanity. People-to-people exchanges really work. There were real friendships that were established that dissolved hate. For Kuang, it made him understand the kindness of many Americans. He learned new ideas, really, to help China modernize. For Twain, he understood the fallacy of racial superiority, the possibility for friendships between different races, the shared common humanity of all races, the inequity and racism of Western imperialism. This enabled him to write some of the greatest literature in American history. And the last point that I'd like to leave is, can we all follow the golden rule? Twain and Kuang understood the common humanity. And for Twain, he put his reader into the shoes of a poor white boy and basically a runaway slave to make people empathize with the other side. So I think it was their hope that Twain and Kuang had was for all people to put themselves into the shoes of the other people. So that's the end. Thank you. What I have here on this slide, I've gone through a lot. And so these are the papers that we've published. You can go to it yourself if you have more questions or if you want to get more details. I have all the sources listed in these journals: in the Pacific Historical Review, the Journal of American East Asian Relations, Modern Asian Studies. Evelyn just presented in Jiangmen. This is at a conference. This one's harder to get if you would like to see it. This is more on the Mark Twain link. Let me know. I've given you my email address over here, so you can send it. So I think we're open to questions.
Yeah, well, yes, thank you so much, Sam, for, and then Evelyn for, that very educational talk. We have 3 questions so far. And then the first one, how old were the children that were sent to Connecticut?
Okay, the ones that were sent to Connecticut, they're actually sent at a very, very young age. Probably they were between like 9 and 13 when they went there. So these were really, really young kids. And it was actually very traumatic for them. If you think about it, you're 10 years old and you're going to be sent on a boat that's going to take 1 to 2 months to get to the US. So most kids did not want to go. So what happened was a lot of the people that went were actually the friends, the children of the friends of the Chinese educational mission leaders. So yeah, they went at a very, very young age, but that also meant that they became very Americanized because they spent like the most formative years of their life learning English. And so they had no Chinese accent. They spoke English perfectly. They were very Americanized. So yeah.
Thank you. So we have other questions from, audience Yi Huan Xu. So I mentioned, thank you so much for this insightful and valuable lecture. I must admit that I was unfamiliar with Kuang until today, and I'm deeply grateful for the introduction. So the question is there any online access to Kuang's first dictionary, or is it only available in physical form?
Okay, the first dictionary, there are only 3 copies in the world. There's one at Yale. There's one at Yale, there's one in Australia, and there's one in Tokyo. It has not been put online yet. There is a book that I actually got I got a microfilm of the Yale copy, and gave it to a Japanese scholar who has actually printed that book. He's reprinted that book. So that is available online. If you send me your email address later, I can give you the sources for that. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds good. And then another question from Zhang Qing. So there was Miss Quentin No. How did the Chinese students legally get married with white spouses?
Um, how did the, I don't think there was anything that there's no legal thing that said they couldn't get married, at least in the states that they were at. That moment they were in Connecticut. It made a lot of press when you had like Yong married his wife. It got an extensive amount of press. Because it was unusual. But it was not illegal for them to get married. Wing had married his wife. He got a lot of press for it because it was just unusual at that time.
Thank you. Another question from Yi Huan. So based on your understanding of Kuang's educational and humanitarian perspectives, what do you think he might do today to promote universal humanities?
I think probably the most important thing right now are probably these people-to-people relationships. This this narrative that China is evil, it's hard to break. There is it's going to take leadership from both sides, and both sides are not doing a great job of it. But if the leadership cannot do it, I do think it is very important to still maintain at the working level these people-to-people exchanges, because if you have more American students going over to China, they're going to realize that, it's not that bad. The Chinese people are not that evil. They will come back to the United States and, express that. And vice versa. Chinese students are going to the US, and when they come back, they will serve as that bridge. When you think about those Chinese educational mission students, the problem is that it's a long-term effort. The Chinese educational mission students, when they came back to China, they became advocates. Even despite all the bad things that happened in terms of the Chinese Exclusion Act, they still became advocates. Kuang, he hated those politicians. He hated James G. Blaine. But still, when he came back to China, he supported the U.S. Consul General in Guangzhou. He didn't want bad relations. He did write articles, opposing a lot of U.S. policy, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, because several versions of it were passed. And he opposed that. But on the friendly and personal level, he wanted Chinese and Americans to get along well. So those are my thoughts. But I really do think it's going to be very, very important for the leadership. I don't see that leadership right now. And I am hoping that, we'll get a new leader. Maybe Kamala Harris will be a little bit better in promoting relations.
Thank you. So the last question is, did the wives went to China with their husbands?
Generally, no. But for a couple of the officials, it did happen. Kuang was one official that he brought in his wife. He actually brought in his second wife. That's not the wife that's related to me, and she actually passed away. It was not common. Generally, it was just men that went over there. And that led to the serious imbalance where, most people in the United States were all men, and there are very few women in the United States.
Great, that's all. Yeah, I just want to kind of once again, yeah, thank you so much, and Sam and Evelyn for such a kind of insightful presentation, Kuang Qizhao, and then I think definitely his life like, yeah, I didn't even, know about him even until, we spoke. So yeah, it was definitely very, kind of eye-opening, but just also, kind of a different perspective, also relevant, given today's both political and, sort of the US-China relations. So yeah, once again, thank you so much. And also, thank you so much for joining us tonight. As mentioned, if you enjoyed tonight's program, please consider supporting us. This will allow us to bring more programs to you, but also please follow us, on our social media, on our website. We have a lot of upcoming programs, then we're also working on our full programs, which will be announced in the coming weeks. So once again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Hope to see you at the next event. Good night.
Thank you, Yifan. Bye-bye.